Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.
And a jolly good morning to you. This is Newsline. We're live as always from the Newsfirst studios in Dorset Street in Colombo. In a world where, especially in Sri Lanka, we're talking about corruption, money laundering, proceeds of crime and all sorts of things like that, we've got an absolute expert here in the studio with us. We've got a barrister from the United Kingdom, Mark Rainsford, QC, who's here in Sri Lanka to attend various seminars, and we've managed to give him an invite to be in our studios this morning and answer some questions in that around all those things. He's right here, live. Mark Rainsford, QC, good morning to you.
Faraz, good morning, and thank you so much for inviting me in. It's a privilege to be here.
Absolute pleasure. The Maharaja Group welcomes you to our studios, and we'll ask you straight away. I'm not entirely sure that I know we have money laundering laws in this country, and only recently has there been an indictment.
Yes.
But it's an ongoing thing, matter. We've not, as far as I know, we've not had a conviction for money laundering in Sri Lanka under these rules. And I'd like to ask you, for the benefit of everyone, could you tell us quite plainly what is money laundering?
Yes. When someone commits a crime, they hope to benefit from that crime. And the benefit, the proceeds of that crime from their criminal conduct represents proceeds of crime. And obviously, if they want to try and get it into the banking system, particularly if it's large sums of money, they want to hide the provenance of that money, the history, the backstory.
Right.
And so they put layers in the way to obscure visibility about where the money originated from.
Right.
That is money laundering. And they'll convert it, disguise it, transfer it.
Right. So what's the first step in money laundering? You need to have an offence first.
If you're proving money laundering,
yeah,
there has to be what we call a predicate offence.
Right. A predicate offence is the initial offence.
Yes.
So in the case of let's say a robbery,
Yeah.
say jewels, the robbery would be the predicate offence.
Yes. Now, sorry, forgive me.
Yes. So when is it a predicate offence only if thereafter the hiding process happens, so to cleanse the money?
Well, obviously, the robbery in its own right would be a criminal offence.
Right.
And you might deal with the robber.
Right.
Because he commits the robbery. But supposing someone orders the robber
Right.
to go and commit it,
Right.
you could prosecute him
Right.
for the robbery because he's helped to organise it.
Right.
Or you might find that they want to hide, if it's a very valuable set of gems
Yeah.
that have been stolen,
Yeah.
they might want to convert it into cash
Right.
and then somehow get the cash into the banking system
Right.
without the backstory.
Right.
And so sometimes professional people help. You might take the jewels into a jeweller who gives cash for it.
Right.
You might then want to go and put the cash into a property, so
Right.
you use a solicitor.
Right. Okay. So those are so that bit when you cash up, that would be the proceeds of crime then.
Yes, as soon as the gems themselves are the proceeds of crime,
Right.
and then when you convert it into cash, the cash becomes the proceeds of crime,
Right.
and remains proceeds of crime as long as it's controlled by someone who knows or suspects that it's proceeds of crime.
Right.
The moment it leaves the hands of a culpable person into the hands of an innocent, unknowing person, it ceases to be the proceeds of crime in their hands.
Right.
But obviously, whatever benefit the criminal gets,
Will always remain
like a credit in a bank account,
Right.
in exchange for the cash,
Okay.
becomes and remains the proceeds of crime.
All right. And
Excuse me.
how big is the problem? Corruption.
Corruption is a global problem. It happens in every country in the world.
Right.
And where it happens, it often happens in different parts of a supply chain.
Right.
And the effect of bribes being paid along the supply chain,
Yeah.
wherever it happens, is to increase the price of the product when it hits the market.
Right.
So if you're talking about food, for example,
Yeah.
the food costs more for a poor person to buy it.
Because.
And they haven't got spare cash to pay more.
Right.
But it erodes the fabric of society, does corruption, because it undermines competition, for example. So if you and I were corrupt and I paid you money to get me onto a TV show when I didn't deserve to be on a TV show, you might have actually given me the chance instead of a better lawyer who should be doing it.
Right.
And so the quality goes down.
Right. Okay.
I hope that's clear. I'm not actually saying that that's
No.
what we
we are happy to have you here along with your presence in Sri Lanka for Transparency International, who, by the way, Transparency International, they this morning at 9:15, you might want to keep up with the news because there are various matters happening at the Bribery Commission when they are taking, they hope to take senior members of government to task. The Newsfirst team will be reporting that news as and when it happens. Now then, we are as usual on Newsline. We encourage you to send us your questions 0772 300 305 by SMS only, please. Do not phone. And we are obviously in conversation with Mark Rainsford, QC. Now then, I want to ask you, when does the identifying process begin? When it's, say the authorities are following somebody for some offence.
Yes.
When does the identification process of their assets start?
When they start tracing the assets.
Right, yes.
They should start right at the beginning. So if a law enforcement authority are in receipt of intelligence that tells them that a suspect is involved in a particularly serious crime, for example, like major bribery or corruption, what they need to do is to identify as soon as possible the asset base of that person, the extent to which the person has benefited from crime, and then take steps to preserve the assets so they're not dissipated, so they're not put out of reach.
So what would they do typically if it's good policing?
Yes.
Active dynamic policing, what would they do? Would they block the assets first before going to court and charging them with money laundering or whatever?
So you might want to find out what somebody's asset base is in your own domestic country.
Yes.
To start with.
Yeah.
You might also at the same time want to make requests of other countries if you believe that they've transferred assets overseas. What is their asset base there? So you can ask for details about people's bank accounts secretly.
Is that done sort of diplomatically, or is there some sort of international law?
It's done by letter, government to government, and it's regulated by treaties and protocols which nations sign up to.
Right.
And they help one another on two levels. One informally, so that you can get the information quickly on an intelligence basis.
Right.
The other, formally, which takes longer, so that you can admit into court proceedings evidence that's come from overseas.
Right.
But may I just say one thing?
Please.
Once you are aware of what someone's assets are, you might want to apply to a court to restrain those assets so the person can't deal with them.
Right.
Either at home or overseas without breaking the law, so that they can't dissipate the asset once they become aware that they are a target of your investigation.
I see. So good policing would involve a sort of a dual track policy, where you identify the assets, put a block on it, and then go to court and charge the person with whatever offence it is.
In my own jurisdiction, where I practice, you would actually go to court probably the day before you search the person's home and restrain their assets.
Oh, I see.
They become aware the next morning when at 6 o'clock in the morning there's a search of their home.
Yeah, it's okay.
That's another means of gaining valuable information because they're not expecting it.
Right, so the unexpected.
And so you find documents that might give you a lead as to where their bank accounts are. You might find gold bullion in their home.
Right. Mark Rainsford, you're a pretty rare QC, even in Britain, because your chambers, I think, practice almost exclusively money laundering, asset recovery.
Yeah, bribery, corruption, fraud.
Indeed.
Asset
So,
recovery
in
that
your
context.
experience, how pliable are nations, different countries, in the providing of this secret information from state to state? How amenable are they to these requests from each
Very
other?
amenable, and where treaties have been signed by nations, for
Yeah.
example, across the entire of Europe, many countries in Asia, in India,
Yeah.
China, America, many countries around the world. But it's not really secret information because there's a very big difference between confidential information on the one hand
Yeah.
and really secret information, for example, that governments hold that they don't want other people to know.
Right.
But it might be confidential that I have a bank account and how much money is in it.
Yeah.
But if I commit crime,
Yeah.
then the rights of the state and the victims to be able to punish me, so it's punitive, to be
Yeah.
able to repair the damage
Yeah.
and pay compensation, has to be balanced.
But may I ask this? Are there some jurisdictions, some territories, some countries who are less amenable than most?
There are countries where they may be reluctant
Yeah.
to assist unless it suits them to do so.
Right.
But I'm not going to
Name
say
them.
on national television which countries they are. I think
Right.
that would be irresponsible,
Yeah.
not least because it's only my own experience
Yeah.
and I could be wrong about that.
Okay. But generally speaking, countries globally are committed to fighting bribery.
Many
corruption.
countries are, and many countries pay lip service to it,
Okay.
and many countries do assist when it suits them to do so and refuse or obfuscate.
Britain is a near $3 trillion economy now, after 46 years in
Yes.
the world's largest trading bloc. I'm not going to ask you a Brexit question, but I am asking you, how bad is the problem in Britain?
It affects Britain just like in every other country. The way that it affects us is not necessarily in the context of politicians taking bribes, for example, for planning permission on developments.
Right,
It's more companies paying bribes overseas to get contracts,
right,
especially very large companies.
right.
And I don't mean all of them.
No,
There are very good major corporates
who trade on their own merit.
who try and trade on merit, and they might have a rogue company within a massive group of companies where
Yeah.
they're paying bribes without them knowing.
Right,
And there are compliance departments whose job it is to try and stop it.
right.
But there are some companies where the contagion goes further up.
Okay,
And the problem is that if companies are very large indeed, it's difficult or potentially difficult in some countries, including our own perhaps, to bring down major corporates because it affects lots of employees' jobs, the tax intake.
right,
Pension funds have stakes in companies
Right.
in the form of shares,
right.
creditors. And so a law enforcement authority would have, and a government indeed, would have to think very seriously about taking on a major...
So is it fair that law enforcement authorities need to consider all these wider matters and implications?
Yes, because they have a duty to have a regard to the public interest.
Right,
Now, many would say, including law enforcement,
yeah,
legitimately argue that you have to take on these big companies because the effect of corruption is so corrosive.
yeah,
So we have to stop it.
yeah,
And unless you actually take on the companies,
yeah,
you're not going to deal with the problem.
right,
But It's people who commit crimes, not companies.
Right.
And so the issue then is, do you go after the legal entity because the entity is responsible for its employees?
Yeah.
Or if the employees are senior enough,
Yeah.
does their conduct inculpate the company as well?
Do you have instances where you have corrupt government ministers or members of government?
It's less prevalent. The highest that you could put it in recent times is where MPs were found responsible for claiming too much by way of expenses.
Right, the expenses.
It's not corruption as you and I are discussing it.
Yes, okay. So you haven't had any more cash for questions sort of type?
No,
events?
I hope we've seen the
Last
end
of that, of the brown envelopes?
I have to tell you, there were many good MPs that were tarnished by the conduct of some of their members.
Right, indeed. Now then, in Sri Lanka, we've had several cases where the targets, if you like, of interest are outside of Sri Lanka's jurisdiction, they're living overseas, and so on. What do our law enforcement authorities need to be asking? Let's say in Singapore, for example, and if the target is there, what should our government be asking them? Very specific, what should they be asking them?
First of all, you have to establish those liaison relationships by treaty.
Right. You'd first of all have to have a treaty in
Then
place.
you can start asking for exchange of information.
Right.
So, for example, you might have an individual here who commits massive scale fraud, transfers the money to somewhere like Switzerland, Luxembourg, could be any number of
Singapore
other,
is
London,
a favorite place.
Singapore. They may have a company in Panama that looks like it owns the property, even though the individual does.
Yes.
The company's shares may be held in trust in the British Virgin Islands.
Right.
The money in London.
Right.
And the victims in Sri Lanka.
Right.
So you might end up having to ask Panama, British Virgin Islands, and London for help.
Right.
And then when you collect the evidence and put it together, hopefully it will show that the defendant was responsible and truly controls the property, so you can take it away.
I see. And let's say you have a conviction in this country.
Yes.
And they want to go after the proceeds of crime.
Yes.
And any assets and so on. And if those assets are held abroad.
Yes.
And where the ownership is quite clear.
Yeah.
And so on. How easy is it? If it's in Britain, how do the courts there view it?
Provided that there is a reasonable basis to suspect that the defendant has benefited from criminal conduct.
Yeah.
You wouldn't have to wait until there's a conviction.
Right.
So supposing you've got evidence to show there's a reasonable basis to suspect someone of major corruption, and you believe that their assets are held in London and that your inquiries show that they have valuable assets in England.
Yeah.
You could do two things. You could start a criminal investigation. You could say, we are going to sue the defendant for the recovery of that money.
Right.
And that once the criminal investigation has shown sufficient evidence to launch a prosecution, we're going to prosecute him.
Yes.
You can then ask them to restrain the assets, even if the money is not the proceeds of the crime.
Right.
So that it's available and held and ring-fenced until the investigation is complete, until you've got a conviction, or until you succeed in a civil case, and then the money can come back to pay the victims. But you need to ask the nation that you're seeking help from to agree to repatriate the money so that the victims can receive it, because often the state itself will keep the money by agreement between nations.
I see.
And the thinking there is you have to take the money out of organised crime to disrupt the criminality.
We have a question from somebody who's watching the program. Thank you very much for watching. British companies follow compliance, but what if they are doing business in a foreign country that is corrupt and contracts are awarded not on merit? Then can the UK government stop giving money to that corrupt country and use it somewhere else?
Technically, yes, but I'm not a politician and I don't know what the actuality is.
Yes, yeah.
But what we do is advise companies that if you're asked for a bribe,
Yeah.
report it, report that fact. Don't do corrupt business.
Right.
And there are a number of reasons why you shouldn't. Firstly, because it undermines the society in the country where it's happening.
Yeah.
Secondly, because it's not good for your business.
Yeah.
Young people don't like to work for corrupt companies.
Indeed. Indeed. But is there a case then that says, look, corruption is very much part of the entire process of development?
Yes.
That in some countries, especially in countries that are, some call it third world or emerging nations or emerging economies, that corruption is part and parcel and it drives development.
Well, my answer to that is until 2001, when there was a change in the law,
Yeah.
you could offset bribes paid overseas by companies to get contracts against their tax liability.
Oh, really? So BAE or any British company could pay out?
Prior to 2001,
Yes.
when the law changed,
Could pay.
coming into force in 2002.
Yes. Be interesting to see their detailed accounts, to see how what they
Well, it's
call
a very
bribes.
long time ago, and
Yes, of course.
and of course it would have been in accordance with the law
At the time.
at the time. But the thinking changed,
Right.
and the changed for the reasons that you and I have discussed.
How, in your experience as a practicing barrister, how is Britain faring in terms of transparency and, in terms of having nominee accounts and so on?
I believe that we are trying hard to combat financial crime. The reason is because organised crime is not clean. People think that financial crime in some way isn't real crime. It is, and it does result in people suffering.
Right, right.
And so we do everything that we can to try and stamp on corruption, including tracing nominee accounts.
Do you find some countries, in spite of their own corruption problems and prevalence of money laundering and all that
Yes.
sort of thing, do you find that some countries traverse the world along with their foreign policy experts and say, "Oi, look, you got to stop your corruption, and you and you and you." But in fact, in their own backyard, corruption is quite
Absolutely.
robust.
And the problem is that nothing is black and white. There are areas of grey.
Right.
So genuinely, governments might encourage, with the assistance of entities like Transparency International, NGOs,
Right.
countries to understand why it is said that corruption is wrong.
Right.
The corrosive effect of corruption. But they might suddenly be presented with a serious problem. And a government's first priority is the security of its own nation. So supposing that you are investigating a major corruption involving your own country and an overseas country, and then the overseas country happens to be one of the biggest suppliers of intelligence about terrorists to your country, and their government say, "Stop this investigation, otherwise you get no more intelligence from us. Oh, and by the way, that major contract that your arms company is undertaking for our government will suddenly stop if you don't stop investigating." What is a government supposed to do then?
As you were speaking, I was thinking about the dismembered bits of Jamal Khashoggi, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and Donald Trump, while you were saying all that.
Yes.
Because we know that Mr. Trump said that he showed up for a big check for $4 billion, and that was the value of what they were supplying Saudi Arabia.
Your point is well made, and these are the issues that politicians have to decide and not lawyers.
Indeed. What do you, if you had a, do you have a blueprint for a country like Sri Lanka where corruption is endemic, and at government level it is absolutely endemic? There's no two words about it.
I don't know about a blueprint. I have some thoughts on the matter.
Right.
Which is only because in the UK we have been dealing with these issues for 25 years. We have learned by our mistakes.
Right.
And lawyers in Sri Lanka, because it's also a common law country, could look at case law in the UK and see the arguments for both sides, the way that the court resolved it, and decide whether they wish to adopt some of those ideas so that they benefit from our mistakes and our learning. It's not that we're better lawyers, we're not. It's just that we've got more experience in that particular area and we're able to help if you need it.
And looking at a wider spectrum, does it help if you had, or how helpful is it if you had a conviction for one very high profile matter, whatever it is, and you successfully prosecute, you successfully go after the proceeds of crime, you recover their assets, whether it is in Sri Lanka or hiding in the Bahamas, where they own an apartment or whatever it is in some other country. How important and how important would such a scenario be?
I would say it's crucially important because people realise when they're in a similar position to the defendant who has been brought down, that they're not above the law. And so it sends out a powerful message that you can't do this and assume that because you're important that you have immunity.
So the law's the law.
Yeah, and you have to respect the rule of law. That is the message.
That is the message.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because our Prime Minister at the moment is saying he's not going to obey the law.
Yes.
But nobody in our country is above the law, and if he made the mistake of actually doing it, I don't think that he would.
Right.
But if he ignores the law that Parliament passes, I suspect that he would be regarded as a criminal rather than a martyr. And I'm not making a political point, I'm talking as a lawyer.
Indeed. Indeed. I wonder if dear Mr. Johnson has seen the insides of Pentonville and all sorts of places like that.
I think he's trying to make a point with Europe. I don't think for one moment he will break the law.
No, indeed. Can I ask you very quickly, what about this proroguing of Parliament in Britain then?
I don't want to make any political points. Some might argue that in the next 7 weeks, Parliament should be scrutinising any deal that the government does. The government might say, well, how can we do a deal in public? We need to do that privately to achieve one. I imagine that many politicians would like to see a deal.
And you keep saying this as a practicing barrister. When you look at the overview, do you think that governments across globally are winning the battle against corruption?
Yes, it's incremental and it takes decades to achieve. I don't think the fact that there's sometimes a glass ceiling, the fact that there's a limit on what you can achieve, should inhibit people from their determination to make it succeed. Because if you achieve a certain level of combating financial crime, it's better than not taking it on at all. And
one MDB from Malaysia, of course, has its tentacles. It's all over the world.
In many, many different countries, yes.
Yes, but we found that the 92-year-old incoming Dr. Mahathir Mohamad took immediate action straight away on corruption. Do you sometimes follow?
I don't know the politics of what's going on there. There have been a number of regime changes and a number of ways of looking at whether there was any criminality or not. It's certainly arguable that there was not criminality, but we'll see.
I'm dying to ask you one question, but I won't because that's not on. Therefore, Mark Rainford QC. Thank you very much for being on Newsline.
a great
We really
pleasure.
appreciate your time.
Thank you for bringing me in.
And do pop in and visit the studios anytime you want to. We are all for eradicating, fighting corruption.
Thank you. It's good to be
Thank you very much, and that's the way it was on Newsline this morning. Take care, have an excellent day ahead, and of course, God bless.
Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.